Hi, I'm Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. The 35mm focal length is probably the classic of all time, so let's have a look at the three lenses that Leica makes. Leica makes three versions of the 35mm lens, and of all the focal lengths that Leica has made over history, the 35mm focal length is the biggest seller. I believe the first one was made and sold in 1930, and it's been the most popular lens ever since. The 50mm lens slightly behind that, but the two are pretty much neck and neck, with the 35mm leading slightly. 35mm lenses are tricky lenses to describe. You're either a 35mm lens person or a 50mm lens person. And in my other video about the 50mm lens, you probably will have got the impression that that was my favorite focal length, and that is true. I personally don't use the 35mm lens very much. I do prefer the 50mm lens, but I have used the lenses. I have got some images to show you, and I have some thoughts about where that 35mm lens might fit into your own bag of tools, bag of lenses, basically. So there's three models. There's the 35mm Summilux, which is the f1.4 version. There's the 35mm Summicron, aspheric. They're both aspheric, these two, which is the f2 maximum aperture version. And then we have the rather special and recently released apo-summicron 35mm M. And this is a completely new design, and I've not had the chance to use it very much, but from what I can tell, it has that next level of micro contrast and detail, a little bit like the 28mm Summilux and the Apo 50mm Summicron as well. So there is a definite step up in quality from these lenses, which are pretty awesome, to this little lens here, which is even more awesome. So let's have a look at some of the images that you can shoot with them. Now, the 35mm focal length it's a hybrid, if you like. It's halfway between normal perspective, the magnification of 1, which is a 50mm lens, give or take a few millimeters, and then compare that to the wide angle lenses, which I'll be talking about in other videos, like the 28. There used to be a 24, well, they don't make that anymore. The 21 and the 18, again, that's a discontinued lens. So the wider lenses will be the 28 and the 21. And those are genuinely, obviously wide angle lenses. The 35mm sits between the 50 and the wides as kind of a bit of both. It's got a foot in both camps. To me, it's neither one thing nor the other, but to other people and other extremely talented photographers as well. So this is just my opinion on the subject. I'm not trying to tell you where you should sit in your own, position with your preferred focal lengths, but it sits between standard and wide in that sort of middle ground, and it offers a bit of both. It offers a wider framing, which some people find easier to work with. The 50mm lens, with its slightly tighter angle of view, is a little bit harder to nail focus when you're working quickly. The 35mm is a little more forgiving. On the other hand, it's harder to organize your image because you have more inside the frame. And this is true for the wider angle lenses too. The wider you go, the more stuff is in your shot, and the harder it is for you to find that point when everything is in just the right place. The 50mm lens allows you to be a little more precise in your framing, therefore eliminating extraneous parts of the picture which aren't helping it. So the 35mm kind of fits in both of those camps. It gives what looks like a very natural viewpoint. Obviously the 50mm is technically the more natural viewpoint, as in the perspective is pretty much like real life. But to some people, the 35mm seems to include more of what you're aware of. Now, I'm going to have comments on the 28mm lens in a future video, and that is actually what I'm going to say about the 28. I find that to be more natural, but again, others may disagree. Now, we are talking subjectivity here. This is purely personal preference. I know I've said that a couple of times, but I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to impose my values or my aesthetics on you. I'm just explaining how I see the whole situation. So this first picture here, this was when I first started shooting with Leica M lenses. This is going back quite a few years, I think, to when the monochrome, the original monochrome, first came out. This is obviously Berlin, and the Holocaust Memorial. And in this situation, the 35mm worked really, really well because I wanted to eliminate the street behind and the scenes to the sides. I just wanted to focus totally on the block shapes and the geometry with that single figure. There's actually two figures in there, but that one main figure in the top right hand corner there. So 35mm worked really well here as a nice hybrid between 50mm, which would have been too tight, and 28mm, which would have been too loose. Something a bit more simple. This is in Sydney. This is one of the old naval yards where they used to build ships in the 60s and 50s. 35mm here was not, it's actually quite tight, this shot. I was quite surprised how the framing worked out. It's, again, quite nice. 28mm would have probably been too wide, although it would have included more of the jib of the crane. 50mm would have been too tight from where I was stood, but of course you could sometimes move away and include more framing. But again, that was the lens I had on the camera, and as a walk-around lens, I think a lot of people find that the 35mm does dual purpose work, because if you shoot with a 50mm lens, for instance, you can't uncrop it if you're too close. But if you shoot with a 35mm lens, particularly if you're shooting with something like an M10R with 40 megapixels, you could always crop it to 50mm and tighten it up a little bit. So in some respects, the 35mm is a little more versatile because it's a 35 and a 50 all in one if you're prepared to crop a little bit. Again, depends on your approach. So then you have the simple, straightforward perspectives. This is an old museum area in Launceston in northern Tasmania, and I was just intrigued by all the different colours and that sort of cubist look about it. And the 35mm has kept that geometry really nice and accurate. I could have shot this with a 50 by standing further away. I could have shot this with a 28 by standing closer. I happen to have a 35mm. This was the Summicron f2 version, as was the previous version, the images I've just showed you. And this has kept the geometry nice, and it also allows you to work in slightly tighter places than a 50mm lens. But again, it's so close in perspective that, you know, either would do the job here. This is out of a hotel window in Melbourne, looking across at one of the other office blocks. I was just quite taken with the sort of the graphic of this, with the green tinged fluoro lights inside, mixed up with the very late evening sort of twilight light on the panels on the outside of the building. And 35mm lens just happened to frame that nicely. Now, of course, you don't always get a choice of where you can stand, and it just so happened that I had a 35mm lens with me, and it just so happened that it was the right focal length for this shot. If I'd had a 28mm lens on or with me, I could have cropped that slightly. So it's important that you don't feel locked into one particular focal length. You know, do always remember that if you shoot a little wider than you need, then you do have some options. But if you shoot too tight, you don't. So I'm kind of talking myself into the 35mm being better than the 50mm, but you know, it is kind of subtle. This is the 35mm Summilux. So this is the f1.4 version, recent shot from the rainforests near Cairns in northern Queensland. Again, I found this was just the right angle for this shot. I have got some shots taken with my 18mm Super Elmar, but I found that that was just a little bit too exaggerated. This from the path was just the right framing for everything, and with a 50mm lens I wouldn't have been able to include the roots of the tree and the palm trees on the left, which I think add a nice balance. So 35mm worked well here. This is the beach on Moreton Island. Actually, I correct myself, Stradbroke Island, just off the coast of Brisbane. And I was quite intrigued to see how the light was captured by the 35mm Summilux in this case. So this shot looking almost into the sun, and this one with the sun just out of frame. And it's handled that backlighting and that potential for flare extremely well. It's very, very subtle indeed. This is the Summilux at about f8. Not wide open, so I wanted a little bit of depth of field to get all the sand sharp, but it has handled that nicely. And then the 35mm Summilux at f1.4 still gives you that three-dimensional quality where the subject stands out from the background really clearly. If you look carefully, you'll see that the distant horizon and the other cows are quite out of focus because it's shot at f1.4, so it does allow you to separate out the background quite nicely. Whether you choose a 35mm lens or a 50mm lens depends to a great extent on what other lenses you have. If you have a 50mm lens, I probably would not recommend getting a 35mm lens as well. I'd get a 28. So something like 28, 50, 90 would be a really nice set. And you can see the focal length doubling more or less. And the same thing applies if you want a 35mm lens. I'd have a 75, a 35, and a 21. So either of those two sets of 3 lenses is probably optimum. And if you had that with one M rangefinder and those 3 lenses of either 2 sets, one of those 2 sets, there's not a lot you can't do with those 3 lenses. But I wouldn't necessarily buy them too close together. Now, obviously, there are some exotics like the 28mm Summicron, which you might want to buy anyway, even if you've got a 35mm lens, or you might want a 50mm Noctilux if you've got a 35mm Summicron. That's up to you entirely. But if you were to choose one lens, I would go with a 50. A lot of people go with a 35. And once you've committed to that, then I would suggest doubling the focal length in one direction, so 35 to 75, and halving it in the other direction, so 35 down to 21, roughly, going for much wider, skipping a focal length, essentially. Anyway, that's my opinion on the 35mm lens. They are all, of course, of extremely high quality. The difference in quality is recognizable between the apochromatic one and the other two. It's subtle, but it's absolutely there. The difference between the Summicron and the Summilux, apart from the fact that the Summilux obviously will allow you to use one shutter speed higher because it has one step of aperture. It allows you to open up the aperture one step more to f1.4. You'll probably find that at f1.4, the quality of the Summilux is about the same as the Summicron at f2, but once you stop down the Summilux to f2, it's slightly sharper in the micro contrast and the fine detail than the Summicron at f2. But then when you stop the Summicron down to 2.8, you are pretty much even, Steven. So essentially, you've got an f2 lens and an f1.4 lens, and that is what you're paying for. That's what gives you that price difference. Quality-wise, at the same f-stop, if you just offset them by 1, you'll find that they're equivalent. So f2 Summilux is better than f2 on the Summicron. And we're talking small amounts here. But once you go to f2.8 on the Summicron, then they're back to pretty much even Steven again. So you are really paying for that extra one step of aperture and that little bit of extra quality at the same aperture. Anyway, I hope you found that useful. My name is Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. In the next video, we'll be talking about the other wides, the 28s and the 21s, and that'll be out in a few weeks. So talk to you then.